Welcome to Mighty Banyans on the Bay.
New College Faculty Conversations.
Our fifth edition of this podcast. My name is Alicia Mercado-Harvey. I'm a professor of Spanish and history, and welcome to our episode.
Hi, and I'm Dr. Bruce Gilley. I'm the Presidential Scholar in Residence here at the New College, and we are very pleased to have with us today Dr. David Ellis, who is Associate Professor of Political Science here at the New College, and is going to talk to us today about some of his publications, his teaching, and some of his interests. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Ellis.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So we always like to get to know our guests a little bit, have them tell us about, how they ended up at New College, a little bit about their journey towards professorship. So tell us about yourself.
No intention of ever getting a PhD, and life took a different turn. But I wound up studying democratization and development after identity conflict. And so how do you repair societies after they've been torn apart by an identity conflict? And that's because I was studying peacekeeping in the early 90s, and you had the atrocities in the Balkans and Rwanda and a number of other places. And then I studied international development in the mid-90s, so merged those two themes together for my doctorate research on democratization and development after identity conflict. And I wound up teaching for a few years after earning my degree, one of which, one stop was here at New College back in 2006 and 7. And then wound up working with the Defense Intelligence Agency during the surge from 2009, basically till about 2022.
That's the surge in Afghanistan.
The surge in Afghanistan, correct. But I wound up working with special operations. So I was based out of the U.S. Special Operations Command for about, just under 4 years, about 3.5 years, and then became a cyber intelligence program manager as a contractor, and worked at the Joint Special Operations University, trying to educate our special operations forces on emerging issues and how to engage, especially local populations, and engage in irregular warfare with population-based activities. So strategic competition, counterinsurgency, and how do you make an interagency process work across the U.S. government? So that's kind of been my recent orientation.
And then getting to New College, what was the last step from there to here?
Well, it was time for a transition in my life, and New College was in a similar place in 2023. I reached out to my old colleagues to see if there would be an opportunity, and I was very, very fortunate to take up a visiting position last year and then come on as tenure track faculty this year.
Fascinating. I mean, I think that your background is just so interesting. And I wanted to ask you first about teaching before we get into scholarship. Like, how is all this experience outside of academia informs your teaching?
It's entirely different when you're in the beast. So I studied really international organization, international institutions upon leaving. And you have a certain idea of what government can and can't do. And then you work in the government, and it's an entirely different reality. So I absolutely love and value the fact that I spent the better part of 14 years, both as a government civilian and as a contractor, in a major command, but also working with a lot of our forces and partner agencies like U.S. Department of State, U.S. Agency for International Development, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Commerce. I got to work with a number of people across a number of different agencies. So it's a really fantastic lens to be able to bring into the classroom.
It's one of those questions we often come across in college education is, should we have practitioners in the classroom? This is the term you'll always hear. Like, we don't want these academics. We want practitioners, people with practical knowledge. I'm a bit skeptical of the pure practitioner who doesn't have the PhD, only because part of our craft is teaching and delivery. So you seem a perfect mix here of the practitioner and the academic.
I was very fortunate at the University of Florida, where I earned my doctorate, to teach a lot. So I had about 4.5 years of my own classes, very strong record as a teacher, a graduate teacher, and then had a number of years teaching undergrads as well. So I had about 9 years of teaching under my belt before ever going into working with the military. So I had a really solid foundation and memory of what teaching undergraduates was like. It's a little bit different now, very different systemic. It's a very different system of education at the secondary level. And so it's been fascinating to see that difference. But to your point, being a scholar practitioner is important in both circumstances. There were paradigms that you could identify in the organizations which became unquestioned reality, and it actually prevented a lot of our strategic success. So my success in that environment was being able to identify what those paradigms were and helping to make the forces aware of it. The same is true when you come back to the campus, because there are just ways we understand how the world works, which are not really how it is in real life. So I think it does matter a lot.
Right. Could you tell us about the courses that you teach currently?
Recently, I've been teaching the Introduction to World Politics course. I've started to think it useful to reframe that as the Introduction to Global Politics course. We're in a different reality from 20 years ago when I first started teaching, when the state was the unquestioned center of international relations. Mm-hmm. There is a very strong push now to make globalization not only a project, not just a phenomenon, but a political project. And so how you teach our young students about the world they're going to grow up in, I think it changes over to global politics as a frame. Second, U.S. foreign policy. So taking what I've learned working in the military and the interagency with the interagency into the classroom. I taught strategic competition and defense policy and challenges for U.S. counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. So those are the courses I've taught so far. And I'll be teaching an international organization class in the spring as well.
It's always interesting to note the students who take classes in world politics, international relations, because, we often think that in a liberal arts education, you're not necessarily aiming for a job in the field where you're taking classes. There are jobs, of course, in international relations. You can become a diplomat, you can join an international organization, you can join the military. But what's your sense of the student interests in taking classes like this at New College?
One of the things I teach my students is apply whatever I'm talking about to the job you're in. Because basically we're talking at politics, it's just at which level. So organizational politics is almost identical to international relations. So the ideas transfer almost perfectly. So I try to frame it in terms of, or especially those courses, in terms of how you're going to interact with others in a business environment. And so strategically, how can you take the concepts that we're applying at the international scale and apply it to the kind of the business world? That's the first thing. The second is we have a lot of students who are interested in international business or are international students themselves. And so that lens is very, very valuable. And I also think that as globalization proceeds, awareness of other cultures and the historical trends are going to be supremely important for anyone who's going to have any real ability to impact their companies or their countries.
Right. Well, this is a good segue to go into your scholarship. And I wanted to particularly talk about your latest book on China. I found this absolutely fascinating because we all, through news and being an educated person know some things about China. But it's just so interesting, some of the parallels and things that you say in the book. One aspect that caught my attention in particular is that you're making the comparison in the introduction about how Germany was around the 30s, and you're saying that Xi Jinping's regime is looking very much like that. Could you elaborate on that?
There has been a real strong debate over the course of the 20th or early part of the 21st century whether or not China was continuing to act as a Marxist-Leninist country. And somewhere around the early 2000s, I started to get the sense that it was adopting much more of a corporatist, which means the government and private industry have a very tight relationship, especially national winners. Possibly even fascist orientation, depending on how it deals with the Han Chinese ethnicity as the primary identity and the sinicization of the culture more broadly. So it became clear, especially as I was concluding the book with my colleagues, that China had started to move back towards a much more controlled economy relative to what it had been, say, in the late 2000s and to the mid 2010s. That Xi Jinping was starting to pull back. We didn't know exactly how far, but it's clear to me that he's moving it back towards a kind of a Leninist orientation, a very strong government control over the important sectors of industry. And that bodes to me much more statist, which is going to be a problem for them because in the end, markets are more dynamic. Markets compete very, very well. They adapt to consumer demand. Statist economies do not. They slow down. And in the competition of great powers, a slow growth rate is very, very problematic, especially for a government that makes its legitimacy entirely dependent on economic growth. So we're at a point where either they begin to liberalize politically and economically so that they can achieve the growth rates, or they're going to start to stifle themselves economically, and that's going to have, I think, major political reverberations domestically.
The title of the book is what?
It's the Competing for Advantage, the Chinese Communist Party, Statecraft, the Chinese Communist Party, and Special Operations. And
so tell us about that title, because I think when people think about, U.S.-China competition and how the U.S. will be responding to China's rise, most people think aircraft carriers, drones, soldiers, number of soldiers under rule. And yet your book, I think, is a very different approach to responding to the China challenge.
One of the joys I had as a resident senior fellow at the Joint Special Operations University was conducting research series. So year and a half long research series, swarming together faculty from across institutions and lenses and disciplines so that we could figure out what a challenge might look like from different lenses. And so we started as strategic competition was rising up in 2019 very clearly. We started with the question, what is China? Because our forces, our military forces, were applying a very state-centric lens. Oh my goodness, 1.4 billion people, an economy the size of ours, they have all the heavy industry and manufacturing, we'll never defeat them. And the response to that was not so fast. China is its own internal set of contradictions, just like every country. Let's focus the lens on what it even means to be China, and then we'll learn from there where the opportunities are to compete strategically. One of the ideas that came out very quickly from the very first iteration was that we're not competing with China, we're competing with the Chinese Communist Party, because it is a party state, not a typical regime like we would imagine in the West. The Chinese Communist Party has very specific vulnerabilities built into it, which now have tentacles across the global economy. They might be able to control what happens inside their own borders, but complexity and things they cannot control will reverberate back through those tentacles. They're purposefully laying out all across the globe. That's where you can compete against the CCP, not China.
So it's kind of like the Soviet Union all over again, in the sense that, the Communist Party is basically what you need to be looking at rather than, China as a country. So
the Soviet Union was slightly different because containment policy more or less worked. They didn't really have good social connections into most of the world. It was state to state, but China's strategy was specifically to go out and build those connections. So as a control-oriented party, it will wind up dealing with nonlinear dynamics they cannot even predict because they have tentacles everywhere that are going to wind up sweeping back into them in ways that they cannot totally comprehend. But if we know that, and we know that there are specific vulnerabilities of the Chinese Communist Party, we can conduct analysis on that and figure out where those vulnerabilities are and target those areas strategically for engagement. Now, how do you do that? That's the question. And that's what a lot of the most recent research has been about.
That's what I was thinking too, Alicia. I was thinking, well, this is kind of reprising the competition with the Soviet Union and asking the question of, can we win this competition without firing a shot? As we did with the Soviet Union, right? And it kind of ended up being the moral rot, the economic rot, the global diplomatic rot, the party rot, caused it to collapse without a shot being fired. And this is, I think, what you guys are looking at in this book is can we achieve the same outcome in the case of free China from the Communist Party?
Very much. And so I was looking initially at the text from the lens of economic development, right? So my international development master's degree, more than the traditional international relations lens, which is very state-centric. So when you think about the challenges we've had during the course of the Cold War, it was first the Soviet Union was going to eat our lunch in the late 60s because of their development trajectory. You start out low, you can rise very, very rapidly, and it looks like an economic miracle. You're going to plateau at some point. Controlled economies are going to plateau much more quickly than more liberalized economies. Then it was Japan was going to eat our lunch in the 1980s. They wound up getting themselves into a very deep economic stagnation over the course of the last 20 years. So if you look at the trajectory that the Chinese Communist Party has set out for itself, rapid growth in an unsustainable way. And now, since the book was actually submitted for publication, a lot has transpired that I think bear out the basic premise. If we think about what causes Chinese economic growth, those are strategic competition vectors. And so mitigate their ability to grow in those areas. We continue the differential growth rate, relative gains that we will accrue will keep us in, I think, an advantageous condition. The only thing we have to make sure is that Taiwan doesn't fall back under the CCP's governance.
It won't. Don't worry. They'll go back and fight.
Yeah.
I know a lot of Taiwanese. They're not going to be taken over, although it might be a costly war.
Right. So I also wanted to ask you about your involvement with, the Afghanistan crisis. That's another of your focuses. And you make a really interesting point about, the rebuilding of in Afghanistan. What the university, the role that caught my attention. So I would like you to talk a little more about that.
Our culture in the U.S. government is a very control-oriented culture, and it has almost a social engineering component to it. It's through science we can know the world and control the world. This is reflected quite a lot in military doctrine on how we do planning, and for good reason. There are things that you can plan over the short term as military operations. So breaking social structures in a very sequenced, organized, systematic way, you can plan for that, and you have to plan for that militarily. Building societies is an entirely different thing. We're dealing with open social systems. They are by definition nonlinear, and so we have to adopt the idea and the mentality of complexity, and that's not how the government works. So my recent research has really been trying to introduce the ideas of complexity into the military, into the interagency process. And if we accept that as the foundation, that you can't actually plan for 4, 5, 6 years, then what's the process that has to be in place that allows you to engage in the real world? Honestly, it's very much a praxis orientation, because you can only intervene for the short term and then reflexively understand what your impact has had, positive or negative. So we created this idea of action research. And that's where universities are really, really valuable. I mentioned these research series. Well, they were rooted in action research. We have a challenge. We know we have a very constrained perspective of what's going on in Burkina Faso or Mali or Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria. So let's swarm together different lenses, different faculty from different disciplines who can tell us what their exposure to the issue suggests. And then we can go from there and say, that's valuable, let's learn more about that. That's going to have a strategic impact. And this is where universities, I think, are extremely important, because we are designed as transdisciplinary centers where it's very easy to swarm together the right people, because you know somebody, that person knows somebody. And because of the interpersonal relationships, we can get the right people very, very quickly. So if we're adopting a complexity orientation to foreign policy, it's about the environment that easily allows the swarming of relevant knowledge. And the benefit to our scholars was they get to see what questions are actually being discussed, or importantly, not discussed. They can conduct research, which we commissioned research. And that's where this edited volume on China comes from. We figured out what was it our forces did not know that they needed to know.
Right.
And then we had scholarly work put together to answer those questions which we could then use as textbooks in our educational processes in the military.
You gave us a tantalizing suggestion that if Dr. Ellis had been in charge of the surge, or maybe the longer war in Afghanistan, the Taliban would not be in power today. So tell us what we did wrong.
Yes, and this is where organizational paradigms come into play. And so the book, Complexity, Organizational Blinders, and the SOCOM Design Way was a direct outgrowth of that experience. I and my co-author, Charlie Black. Basically what we recognized was the idea of complexity was little known within the military for good reasons. The literature only really kind of came together in the last couple of decades anyway. But we started to realize also that the lenses that we were bringing on what state building and nation building constitutes is a critical blinder. State Department, USAID, very top-down, government-centric. Well, that doesn't work in complex systems because you're trying to make the localities conform to the grand plan. And if the intention is to try to build legitimacy from the bottom up, make it sustainable, you have to figure out what matters to the population as they're living in the moment. And this is where I was very fortunate that I wasn't socialized into military intelligence, that I came from a background in international development and peasantry studies and things I never thought I would actually use. What we realized was this was a below subsistence population, rain-fed, below subsistence farming population. 70 to 80% lived out in the rural areas, and our strategy was entirely built around an urban ring road, and most of the population had never actually been engaged. So what we wound up doing is taking a population that could not feed itself throughout the year, not engaging it in any meaningful way, and then destroying the one commodity that was actually preservable, which was poppy. The only folks who figured this out were the narco-traffickers.
Right.
They would provide the seed, the fertilizer, they would process it, and then return it as opium bricks, which were then the store of value because there was no banking system. Now, special operations, as an example, owned that environment, especially after 2014. We continued to make commandos, go out, bust the enemy up. And for good reason, that is a necessary component of any war. But we also could have made Afghanistan-oriented civil affairs who are taught in farming practices, provide the broken logistics supply chain to bring the knowledge of food preservation back, to help eliminate the debt bondage, the 2-year debt bondage cycle that these rural farmers were engaged with the narco traffickers. Those things were all knowable. Those things could have been incorporated into our strategy and changed the narrative about what the government and the military, Afghan military and our military, were providing to the general population. I was able to see a little bit of this in village stability operations from 2010 to 2012. I deployed from 2010 to 2011 to Afghanistan, built this framework into the design of village stability operations, and had very, very rapid operational level impact. The Taliban actually considered this to be the worst strategic threat that they had faced.
It sounds a lot like the Villages program in the Vietnam War too, where they were doing similar things, is try and draw people into villages and make them sustainable, give them housing, give them agriculture, legitimacy from the ground up, as you say. And
a lot of people who worked that program helped revive that idea at U.S. Special Operations Command. Now, this is right when I'm coming in 2009. The intelligence folks don't know what to do with me because a PhD with no military background. What are we going to do with them, but with him? But the other interagency groups that were working on this challenge did bring me in, and that's where I was able to actually contribute in a very meaningful way. And so folks from counterinsurgencies in Central America, Vietnam, very much informed and retaught us lessons that we had basically forgotten in the military, purposely purged in a lot of cases. And now we're in danger of doing the same thing again. So,
Wow, that's fascinating. So could you tell us a little more about what is your next project? What are you working on as your next book?
I've recently talked to a publisher on what would a complexity-oriented foreign policy look like. This is, I think, kind of where the forefront is, and most of the work that I've done recently has been practitioner-oriented. As a government contractor, they want the research to be for the person at the pointy end of the spear. I very much enjoy that. I like the idea that the research is not going to sit on the shelf for other academics per se, but be oriented towards practitioners. There, I believe, is a reasonable gap, if not a significant gap, in the U.S. foreign policy literature when it comes to a complexity orientation. We have this idea of international order. We have an idea of control. Well, what if that's not true? And then how do you think about grand strategy if the planning and nonlinear dynamics is not really possible? So how do you imagine grand strategy if complexity theory is accurate?
Looks like it'll be eagerly awaited. In our last few minutes together, Dr. Ellis, because you're such an intimidating professor, I'm sure the teachers, the students are wondering, can I actually connect this with this guy? What advice do you have for prospective students to new college, considering majors, maybe considering international relations, considering taking a class from you? What would you say to students who are kind of listening to you and thinking, that kind of sounds interesting, but I'm a little intimidated?
Don't be. This is actually the most this period of history is going to be extremely dynamic. It is one where the ideas that we're talking about right now will shape your future. They are accessible. It's easy to teach. And I think this is kind of the forefront of where the discipline is heading. And you would be right on the cusp of it.
And they can contact you in an email that will drop into the
dellis@ncf.edu.
So since you brought discipline, this is a question that I have in general about political science, because it seemed like for a while it was really going to this quantitative thing. And so is that switching back to more what you're doing now?
That's a very interesting question. So it depends on the discipline. I have a friend in comparative politics who says it is that particular subdiscipline is moving very heavily towards quantitative, which is ironic because comparative was very much about local conditions, historical context, and nuance.
Right.
So when I think about international relations, I say you cannot practice foreign policy and international relations without the nuance of comparative lenses. So I don't know that international relations is necessarily moving totally quant, but there has always been that strain of it. I would highly recommend to anyone who's looking at international relations or comparative politics, get deep history, because the more we accept, or if you accept the idea of the complexity lens, it's all about local conditions, collective memory, and how people discuss their worldviews and what has come before, and that will help limit or prescribe their future pathways. You cannot do political science without history.
So glad to hear that, because I teach history and I 100% agree with you.
Everything I did with Afghanistan, the Sahara, the Sahel, the Middle East, with special operations was education about the history, because that's what drives behavior. And it's not something our system actually demands, but that is where we must go.
And as of now, there is no stats prereq for the political science major at New College, so don't worry, you won't need to do statistics.
You should learn a little.
Well, it's been great to have you, Dr. Ellis. Thanks for joining us today, telling us about your fascinating research. Students, if you're interested, do reach out directly to Dr. Ellis. He's very available. It's been great to have you. And as we always say at the end of the podcast,
Yes.
Go
Mighty Banyans!